Thank you all for joining. I now have the pleasure to introduce the president of Public-Private Strategies Institute, Rhett Buttle.
Well, hello and good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're joining us from. As Claire mentioned, my name is Rhett Buttle. I'm proud to serve as the president of the Public-Private Strategies Institute. Today, we are so thrilled to be able to offer business leaders from across the country an immense opportunity to hear from senior White House officials about the current conversation around the debt limit and how important it is that we raise the debt limit to the private sector, to so many business leaders across the country who are out there creating jobs every day. And so we'll be joined by everyone from small business leaders to executives today from across the country. I first just want to add huge thanks before we hop into the program to so many of our amazing partners who co-sponsored on this event today. We have local chambers of commerce, Rotary clubs, business organizations from all across the country who make today possible by sharing this information and news with your membership. So thank you for being partners in today's briefing. With that, we're going to hear opening remarks, and then we want to make sure to take question and answer as well so that we can hear from folks around the country. And then we'll wrap up this conversation by steps that you can take as a business leader to make sure that you're getting involved with this issue. So it is now my pleasure to turn the conversation over to a friend and a colleague. You'll see all of our partners up on the screen today who made this conversation possible. So thanks to you. And with that, I want to take a moment to introduce Aviva, who serves as the Deputy Director of the National Economic Council. We couldn't have someone better in this role. She's an amazing champion. The reason I know that is we had the privilege of serving together at the Department of Health and Human Services under the Obama administration. And I got to see her in action every day fighting for American businesses and working families. And so we're thrilled to be able to have a friend and colleague at the National Economic Council, now at the White House. And with that, Aviva, we'll turn it over to you to give an update on the debt ceiling conversation, and then we'll take some questions. So Aviva, over to you.
Thank you so much, Rhett, and thank you to everyone who jointly sponsored this briefing. Just to introduce myself again, I'm Aviva Aron-Dine. I'm the Deputy Director here at the National Economic Council at the White House. And I wanted to speak to three topics related to the current debt limit debate, and then looking forward to your questions. First, just giving some background on the debt limit. Second, talking about the economic consequences of debt limit brinksmanship or default. And then finally, giving a bit of an update about the House legislation being debated this week, why it's harmful, and also why it's just not a viable path forward. So to start with some background, the single most important thing to know about the debt limit is that it is about whether Treasury can pay the bills for the spending Congress has already approved. It is not about the future trajectory of deficits and debt. Future debt and deficits are determined by decisions Congress will make about spending and taxes through the regular budget process. But what reaching the debt limit means is that Treasury can't keep making payments for the spending that Congress has already approved without issuing new debt. And that's why failing to address the debt limit periodically, as Congress has always done in the past, would result in unprecedented defaults. Another important thing to know is how Congress has generally addressed the debt limit. Over the past decade, Congress has adjusted the debt limit 9 times to avert default, 3 of them during the Trump administration. And probably most of those times, most people on this call don't even remember, and that's because it occurred without brinksmanship, without conditionality, and really without fanfare, sort of just discharging that basic obligation. So what would happen if that did not occur? A US default would be an economic calamity. At the same time, because it's never happened before, there's no direct precedent for what would occur. So here's what we do know about what one could anticipate. First, we do have direct experience with what can happen as a result of brinksmanship. In 2011, Congress did go down to the wire on raising the debt limit with a somewhat similar dynamic to what we're seeing today. And the result was an increase in interest rates on federal debt and increased volatility. The GAO calculated that the federal government incurred over $1 billion in extra interest costs just due to that brinksmanship. There was a 17% decline in the value of the S&P. There was a downgrade of the US credit rating. And again, all of that was without a default. It was just from brinksmanship, just from getting close. Experts generally conclude that even a short default would very likely spark a financial crisis of unknown magnitude. in recent weeks, we've seen a number of people compare what happened in the markets with SVB to what could happen with even a short breach of the debt limit, and reach the conclusion that there really is no comparison. The latter would be far more severe. Experts have made comparisons to the fall of Lehman Brothers. Those who have tried to do quantitative comparisons, like Mark Sandy, the chief economist at Moody's, conclude that there would be spikes in interest rates, declines in the value of equities, and nearly 1 million lost jobs, and risks of long-term severe consequences, especially if the dollar was no longer seen as a global safe asset. A longer default could be even more catastrophic, and prioritization, which is sometimes talked about as if it were an alternative default to default, is really just default by another name, because at the point where the federal government ceases to make all of its payments that are due, that are legally owed on schedule, you create that economic risk, the perception that the federal government is no longer an entity that can be counted on to pay its bills, and thereby really jeopardize that full faith and credit of the United States. Finally, before turning to your questions, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the conversation that's going on in Washington now around the legislation introduced by Speaker McCarthy and being debated in the House. This legislation would only allow the general stance, Speaker McCarthy's general stance laid out in his speech last week, is that he would only allow the federal government to pay its bills if coupled with an agenda that House Republicans really know they can't advance through the regular legislative process and are therefore trying to advance through this hostage taking with the ability of the federal government to pay its bills. The president believes that that's wrong, that the ability of the US to pay its bills, that avoiding default should not be conditioned on any set of unrelated policy demands. But it is also the case that this particular set of policy demands would do significant economic damage. So just to highlight a few pieces, at the core of the bill is a proposal to cap discretionary spending, which might sound reasonable or innocuous, but in fact, once you take into account the intent to protect defense, it would mean a 22% cut start in 2023 to, for example, virtually all research and development funding from the federal government, including all the authorized increases from the CHIPS and Science Act, to basic functions of government like food safety, drug safety, rail safety, air safety, to virtually all federal education funding, and to other critical areas, including essentially all small business programs. The bill includes harsh cuts to Medicaid and to food assistance, and repeal of the Inflation Reduction Act tax credits that are catalyzing major investments in clean energy. And while the premise of the Republican legislation is that deficit reduction is an urgent priority, it includes no new revenue. And in fact, Republicans are advancing on a parallel track expensive tax cuts that would add to the debt. The president, of course, has laid out a very different agenda, including a different way of achieving nearly $3 trillion in deficit reduction in his budget. But more importantly, he just doesn't think that the full faith and credit of the United States and the stability of the US economy should be held hostage to any unrelated policy agenda. So he urges and continues to expect Congress to fulfill that basic responsibility and avert default. With that, Rhett, eager to answer questions from this group.
Awesome. So Q&A is now open. I see folks already dropping some question and answers into the chat. So we had some come in, Aviva, while you were giving us the brief. First is, and what I'm going to try to do is take some of the questions and conglomerate as many together as we can. But seeing a lot about America's recovery and a lot of folks in the chat nodding to a lot of the bipartisan legislation that was passed. So, you know, the bipartisan infrastructure law, the CHIPS and Sciences Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, you know, all of these laws putting America on the path to recovering from something that was unprecedented, a pandemic. And so questions about, you know, what would something like a potential debt ceiling default mean, either A, for the implementation of those laws, or B, for our general economic recovery?
Thanks for that question. A default, the effects of a default can't be predicted with certainty because we've never experienced it. But the best reference point that we have experienced are a variety of financial crises. And I don't think I need to explain to this group what that would mean for small businesses. We've experienced credit crunches. We've experienced, you know, spiking interest rates, volatility. All of that would be very likely here and likely on just a different order of magnitude, a different scale. Add to that the fact that the federal government likely would not be able to make its payments. And so whether you're talking about implementation of these laws or even just the basic contractual relationship the federal government has with businesses across the country, with flows of payments every day, all of that would be at risk. I do also think that, an underappreciated aspect of the House Republican bill, what they're trying to condition the debt limit, addressing the debt limit on, is the extent to which it really throws overboard all of those bipartisan and other legislation of the past couple years. So as a starting point, coming out of the decade in which there were caps on discretionary spending, caps on the federal government's ability to spend on research, on education, and other areas, the bipartisan omnibus appropriations bills of the last 2 years made some really important investments in those areas, and those would be completely gutted. The CHIPS and Science Act, which I know many folks on this call were engaged with, depends for the and science part depends entirely on future discretionary appropriations, which would be gutted under this bill. And then, of course, the bill directly repeals the tax credits in the Inflation Reduction Act that are paying for clean energy investments, which I know is also something many folks have worked on. So I do think it's a little bit of an inflection point, both a clear inflection point on default, which would be a catastrophic risk to the economy, and an inflection point on the agenda for all of these policy priorities that had been advanced over the last couple of years.
Super helpful context. I'm getting some questions less on the policy side, but more about communication, which I think, part of the reason we're having this conversation today is, as you were mentioning, this used to just kind of happen. It was normal, regular business. And, in the last few years, it has come to light. And I think folks have a hard time sometimes understanding what the debt limit is and what explaining it is. And so is there some advice about, how business leaders should be communicating about this issue? We know that business leaders are seen as leaders in their communities. Their employees are trying to help them, employees turn to them to better understand information. And so for folks who are getting asked questions about this, how do they communicate about it?
That's a great question. I think, just as you said, business leaders are incredibly important, trusted voices in this debate. And I think that's in a few different respects. The first is just the sort of basic common sense point that once you've committed to making a payment, once you've committed to purchasing a service, you've signed a contract, you've bought something, you've even had it delivered, you can't just decide you don't feel like paying for it because you don't look like what your sort of balances look like at the end of the month, right? If you're concerned about your sort of overall budget, you have to make decisions about your cash flows, your spending, your revenues going forward, not just tear up the bill for the services you've already committed to purchase. And I think even though, just that sort of basic analogy, that basic common sense of, any business owner knows that they need to pay the bills, and for the federal government to suddenly refuse to pay those, to make good on its obligations, would be catastrophic for all of us. I think that is a really important thread here. And then, of course, I think business leaders are a trusted voice on the broader sort of impacts on communities if we were really to experience the kind of financial crisis that could result from a default. I think, there have been a number of really important voices sort of coming to the table in this debate today so far. We've heard from economists of both parties. We've heard from national security leaders from both parties, really, I think, explaining how damaging it would be to the world standing of the United States if we stood up and said, we're not paying our bills, from bipartisan governors and mayors. But I do think that the local business voice is just has a unique credibility in helping people understand what's at stake here.
One of the themes that I'm seeing in the chat of questions is the theme around uncertainty. And, I've been working with business leaders a long time around public policy issues, and businesses have a hard time when they can't plan. And I think it feels a little bit like we're living in an uncertain moment every time we reach one of these. And I'm just wondering, what the business leaders on this call need to know about, like, how they communicate about this uncertainty, because with the government being unable to raise the debt limit, obviously we're operating in an uncertain period here. And we know the federal government is the largest buyer of goods and services in the world, right? And so anyone who's doing some sort of business with the government. So anything you can say kind of on the uncertainty piece and what exactly that means for the private sector.
No, that's absolutely right. And we're operating in a period of uncertainty in a lot of ways. We've never emerged from a global pandemic before. That creates uncertainty. There's uncertainty created by some of what we've seen in the financial system. There's uncertainty related to the economic recovery in the labor market. And so I think that an important thing to try to explain about this source of uncertainty is that it's completely unnecessary. It's completely manufactured by this congressional standoff, this attempt to use the full faith and credit of the United States as leverage, this departure from what sort of used to be common practice of just getting this done. It's a source of uncertainty that could go away tomorrow if Congress were to act to address the debt limit. I think that sort of ties to another theme that I think can potentially be powerful here, which is just in general how wasteful and foolish this kind of brinksmanship is. The sort of whole premise of the congressional Republican position is that this is based on concern about the debt. And yet, what we saw was that brinksmanship in 2011 added over $1 billion to federal interest costs, and that was without even breaching the debt limit. There's been calculations that if you were to breach the debt limit and that led to a sort of long-term loss of confidence in treasuries as the world's safest asset, you could be increasing federal borrowing costs over time by hundreds of billions of dollars. So adding hundreds of billions of dollars to deficits and debt if there were to be an actual default. And all of that without accomplishing really anything for anyone, just as a purely wasteful function of this kind of brinksmanship. And so, no one is suggesting in any way that there shouldn't be a conversation about the budget or about spending and revenues. And in fact, when it comes to appropriations, to discretionary spending, which is the main focus of the Republican proposal, there's a debate every single year. Every single year, Congress has to negotiate and pass those bills, and it's been done on a bipartisan basis, and there's been give and take and back and forth in different positions. But I think what's different here is this attempt to use the risk of global economic catastrophe as sort of one-sided leverage. And that's what's so damaging and harmful, and what we sort of keep coming back to in a lot of our discussion of this issue.
Super helpful. We're getting close to the time. I'm going to give you the chance to add anything you want. But before that, I wanted to kind of tackle two questions. One is, I think you went through some of the programs that would potentially, be harmed or cut under a potential House proposal. And so I'm just wondering if you can reline those so we can see the difference between the two. But also, I mean, for people who are concerned about the debt, and I think sometimes debt limit isn't the right phrase. You kind of outlined a little bit about the beginning about this is really about the federal government being able to meet the obligations that it's already been met. It's less about more accrued debt necessarily. So would love to just, because those are sort of the questions that I'm hearing in the chat. And so anything you see there on those two pieces that you can sort of further expand on and sort of reiterate for folks.
Yeah, let me start with the second question, because I think, the president agrees that we should be trying to make progress on the nation's long-term fiscal challenges. And so he put out a budget that, through a combination of spending and tax proposals that encompasses his full agenda, reduces deficits by nearly $3 trillion over the next 10 years. So that's a proposal for reducing the deficit. We think that's a better way to go about reducing the deficit than the proposal on the table from Speaker McCarthy. So under the president's proposal, most of the deficit reduction comes from revenue-raising measures, things like closing loopholes in the international tax system, putting in place a minimum tax that ensures that very wealthy people pay at least 25% of income in taxes, closing loopholes for things like real estate or oil and gas, other, a whole set of tax proposals that we think are a good way to raise revenue, and comes from building on the prescription drug reforms in the Inflation Reduction Act in a way that would further reduce prescription drug costs for both the federal government and individuals, both people with Medicare and employer coverage. So that's one approach. House Republicans have put forward a different approach to cutting the deficit. Their version raises no revenue. In fact, it cuts taxes further. And it makes particularly deep cuts to a set of programs, including all of those that are funded through discretionary appropriations. So that includes essentially all research funding, essentially all education funding, veterans medical care, and funding to administer veterans benefits. So things like wait times for veterans benefits, wait times for Social Security benefits would go up. It includes virtually all small business assistance programs. It includes things like childcare and Head Start, and includes some of the very basic functions of government. So food safety, drug safety, air safety, the things that just go on in the background that we assume that the federal government is taking care of and don't even think about would be cut deeply under this. Also harshly cut Medicaid and SNAP food assistance, and it would repeal the Inflation Reduction Act tax credits. I could tell you lots of reasons that I think that's the wrong way to reduce the deficit, and the president's approach is a better way. But what I would hope we could all agree is that defaulting on the debt is no one's preferred approach for dealing with our fiscal or economic future. It would devastate the economy. It could actually raise interest costs and thereby raise federal deficits. And so that's why, in our view, this is just the wrong approach to even enter these budget debates. There should be a budget debate. Republicans should put their full proposal, their full budget on the table. Every year we negotiate appropriated spending, and that will occur this year as well. But when it comes to the full faith and credit of the United States, that shouldn't be a bargaining chip for anybody's sort of preferred policies that they can't advance through the regular legislative process. That should just be something that is without question. It should just be a safe assumption that the United States is going to pay its bills.
Yeah, I think it's helpful context to understand that what's happening is unprecedented and out of sort of normal order, and being used to sort of, push an agenda versus sort of the administration saying we're open to negotiate through the normal channels and the normal legislative process and all of that. I think it's an important point. What I'm going to do is, because we have so many questions, Aviva, is we're actually just going to give you a printout of the questions so that as you guys are putting out more fact sheets, you can incorporate some of this good knowledge. Before we turn to Jana and the public engagement team, is there anything you want to sort of add in closing that would be helpful for folks to take away?
Sure. So I think one other question that frequently comes up in these conversations is, what's the end game going to be? And I don't have a crystal ball. I can't quite tell you, but I can tell you two things. One is that the end game is not going to be the president caving to this kind of hostage taking. That's not what's going to occur. And the second thing is, what the end game has been for the last decade, which is that, sometimes there's some nail biting and it's a little, you get a little down to the wire, but ultimately Congress figures it out and meets its obligations and does address the debt limit without this kind of conditionality. So certainly that's my hope for the end game this time, but it does depend on a solid public understanding of what's at stake. And so really appreciate the opportunity to talk with all of you about that.
That's awesome. And I'm sorry we couldn't get to everyone's questions. I promise we will print this out and hound down Aviva and Jana so that they can see everyone's comments. We're also making this available to everyone online. So with that, Aviva, we know you have 50 million places to be. Huge thanks on behalf of us and all of our partners for being here. Hopefully we'll be able to have another conversation on some more forward-looking issues in the coming months. And with that, it's my pleasure to now welcome into the conversation Jana Platt. Many of you know, who's been with the Biden administration since the early days, has long been a champion of both the business and small business community, joining the administration from Business Forward, amongst a number of other places. And so, Jana, we would just love to hear from you. We've got a cadre of folks on the phone, how folks should be thinking about getting engaged, both on this issue and sort of moving forward.
Thanks, Rhett, and also thanks to my colleague Aviva. I mean, it's great to have extremely smart colleagues, and I think she laid out exactly what the highlights of the threats that what could happen if we default. I mean, I think it's really important for us to stay close to you all, and thanks, Rhett and your team, for hosting us. I know we will commit to whatever we need to do to make sure that information is getting to our small business community. All of our local partners who sent out this invite to include their membership, thank you. Again, there's this uncertainty that I feel as though that we can all get involved to make sure that folks are hearing from the small business community. I mean, this is addressing this debt ceiling issue is crucial. And I think the first thing that we all need to do is make sure that we're all connected. Rhett, thank you for offering to send us all of those questions. We want to hear from you, but also it's going to be most important is for you to use your voice. I think Aviva said it, just incredibly, on key, hit the nail on the head. You are be trusted messengers to your communities, to your customers, to your consumers, to your friends, to your families, to your neighbors. So we will continue to commit to doing whatever we can to make sure that you're as informed as you can as we continue to move forward. But most importantly, I think for you all to speak out. I think continue to be involved. Reach out to the organizations that invited you to this briefing. Reach out back to the all of your partners that are around you. I think all of our small business partners, all of the local chambers that also sent this out, you provide resources for so many small business owners. So making sure that we are all sharing our experiences and most importantly, sharing our voice to make sure that we commit to this obligation and making sure that folks understand that from the business community and from the small business community that this debt ceiling issue is crucial and critical. And again, I think we are a resource, happy to make sure that you have the information that you need to stay involved and to be as educated as possible. Really, thank you. I do want to say one more thing, Rhett, if you'll let me. Next week is National Small Business Week. So looking forward to continuing to drive home this message with you all during National Small Business Week. If you haven't seen what's coming out of the Small Business Association, reach out. They have a website set up. They have a few different free virtual webinars for next week as well. So for those that are partnering with us for next week, thank you again. But really now is the time that we all need to speak up and reach out to your organizations if you need more information on how to do that. And with that, again, thank you for your time. Thank you for joining us. And again, we want to stay involved. We want to stay, alongside of all of you as we continue to have this conversation.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Jana. Thank you, Aviva. Thank you to the whole team for making this opportunity available. What we will do is there's a few fact sheets that the administration has put out. We will make those available to everyone post this call. This recording will be available to folks. And then I know Jana mentioned and sort of previewed that National Small Business Week is coming and that the U.S. Small Business Administration, as well as partners across the administration, and also many folks across the Hill will be doing things. So we will also wrap that up and share it with everyone who registered for this call. With that, we want to thank you. We know your time is valuable. We try to keep these brief into 30 minutes to give you as much information as possible. And while we weren't able to dig into everything today, we're hoping we were able to give you some firm basic understanding of the issue, things that might be important for the economy and you as a business owner, and then finally some ways to get involved. So look forward to you being in touch, and please check your email for further details. With that, this is now the conclusion of the event. Thanks so much for joining us today.